Good morning, everybody, from a very wet Cardiff. Unsurprisingly, there. Good morning to you all, and thank you for the keynote speech. That was very, very interesting. Welcome to the first session. My name is Nick Ryder, and I'd like to thank the committee for inviting me to chair the first session today. We have four fantastic speakers between roughly 20 past 10 and 20 past 11. And the first session is on illicit financial flows, definitions, arguments, processes, and solutions. So it's a great honor to introduce our first speaker today, Ms. Lucky Star Miandazi from the United Nations Development Programme. And her paper is entitled Illicit Financial Flows, Definitions and Concepts. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Nicholas, and thank you to the rest of the organizing team. I'd like to acknowledge my fellow colleagues, Dr. Folashade, Dr. Lovina, Dr. Joy, and also Dr. Nkechi, and also the network coordinator, Ms. Adeola. It's a pleasure to join today, and actually a bit intimidating to go after BC, Professor Ola BC, after such a profound keynote that touched on so many areas that my presentation is going to have. But this presentation is sticking to the title of what I was asked to speak on, and I will just touch on a lot of the policy issues that international organizations focus on, and also mention a little bit about the work that I'm doing with UNDP and OECD with the Tax Inspectors Without Borders. So the first is to start with not such a positive note, but probably a somber note, which is there is no consensus on a definition of illicit financial flows. So we actually do not have an agreement on how to define illicit financial flows. But what we do have an international, this is at the international level and also at the regional level, meaning at the Africa level. But what we do have is a consensus that there is a clear need of dealing with curbing illicit financial flows, especially as it affects domestic resource mobilization and raising of funds towards financing their sustainable development goals. And where do I get this consensus from? This comes from the agreement with countries in 2015 to adopt the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Within the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, there is an explicit indication under SDG 16.4, which alludes to the issue of ending illicit financial flows, or just acknowledges the fact that we need to reduce illicit financial flows by 2030. And there are certain indicators. And there's also, based on research that has been done by the OECD, there's about 22 other SDG targets that touch on various issues of illicit financial flows. This research has also been done by UNCTAD that shows this. But at the Africa level, we also have the AU, which has done a research on this through the Mbeki panel report, which was formed in 2011 and did a research until 2015 when they produced a paper on illicit financial flows. So this issue has actually been at the heart of discussions on tax issues at the international fora, and especially, you know, some of the quotes that we've had about money leaving Africa. But why is it important to define illicit financial flows, or rather to sort of have a basis for definition of illicit financial flows? It is because it affects how we look at illicit financial flows, the types of illicit financial flows, the volume of illicit financial flows, its impact, the channels that it takes, the origin, as Professor Olabisi was saying, they flow from African countries or developing countries. Where do they go? They go mostly to developed countries. So this is a dynamic that we've seen, and it's important to have a basis of definition. Next slide, please. So in this slide, I took it from a research paper that I did with a colleague in 2018, looking specifically at the dynamics, or rather this paradox of defining illicit financial flows. So in our research, we decided to classify the various definitions that exist on illicit financial flows into three. And then when we finished defining them into three, or categorizing them into three, we realized that there is a fourth one, which is not really a definition, but just the option of actually not using or not defining illicit financial flows. So very quickly, the first one we found was the legal approach, or the legalistic approach in this case. And this one is defining illicit financial flows as illegal. So money that is illegally acquired, transferred, or used. So this is very clear cut. It's the legal method of saying tax evasion, for example. If you don't pay your taxes, or if you're found to take part in tax evasion, you will go to prison, you will face the law. The second type of definition of illicit financial flows is the normative definition. And this normative definition, we took it from the Mbeki report. Now, this normative definition is a bit fuzzy because it defines illicit financial flows as money that is illegally earned or utilized, which is the legal method. But it also includes, if you continue reading the Mbeki panel report, for example, it also includes certain elements that are not really illegal, so which fall on the avoidance side. So I'll just give an example. In the Mbeki report, it categorizes illicit financial flows in commercial means, based on sources, criminal means, and those that occur through corruption. And to have something like in commercial means, to have other elements that would be classified as tax avoidance and not necessarily tax evasion. So those are not really illegal methods. It's sometimes companies, for example, taking advantage of loopholes within the law to avoid taxes rather than evade taxes. So we define this as a normative approach, which is very, very broad. And I will explain when I come to the implications. The third definition is developmental definition of illicit financial flows. Now, this is a very favored approach, especially from my institutions and other international institutions, and also from research that we did, and also research that has been done on political economy analysis, especially with such people as Professor Mustaf Khan and Blackenberg. So this one defines illicit financial flows as anything that affects the social, economic, and political stability and development of a country. This is quite wide and quite broad, as you might see, and it would be something that would say, for example, include lawful transactions also, as was said. So would be something that can be lawful, but until you're found that this is like aggressive tax planning, that it can be lawful until it's not. So this is the type that affects profit shifting, that takes money away from one country into another. So until there's a developmental impact that affects the country where the money is being taken out from, then it's defined as illicit financial flows. And then the last option is not to use the term illicit financial flows. So this one goes to just avoid it as a term in itself and use other means of defining what would be looked at as illicit financial flows, but just going with directly calling it tax evasion, tax avoidance, directly calling it transfer pricing or transfer mispricing. Now, what are the implications of this definition? So very quickly, the implications are always on data. So how we quantify illicit financial flows. I will speak on the legal side, I won't speak so much because, as I've said, that's very clear. But on the normative and developmental side, it's sometimes very hard to quantify. Again, given that illicit financial flows, as Professor Olabisi said, there's a lot of secrecy around illicit financial flows, and it's very hard to identify them and to also find data that actually quantifies it, to aggregate it. So there's been a lot of figures and numbers that we've seen out there. For example, the Mbeki report panel in 2015, in their report, they said Africa loses up to $50 billion per year through illicit financial flows, through those activities, commercial, criminal, and corrupt activities. However, through this, they said 65% is from commercial, criminal is 30%, and corruption is 5%. And this is very hard, for example, to quantify what exactly they put under 5% of corruption. What did they put under 30% of the criminal activities, and what they put under 6. So it was very hard to really pinpoint this aggregated data. And a lot of the data used in numbers of illicit financial flows is actually trade data. Because that's easier to find, and the countries at trade level and customs store this data. And we've seen now in 2020, and the report came out from UNCTAD, which said that Africa loses up to 88.6 billion every year, which is equivalent to 3.7% of Africa's GDP through illicit financial flows. Again, this is they explained how they came about this figure, but again, there's a lot of caveats riots that were involved. And this shows the difficulty in measuring illicit financial flows. So then there I put in some of the problematic questions that come in, even from the legal side, like whose law decides what's legal and illegal, what kind of norms we follow when we're talking about the normative approach. You know, when it's tax avoidance, it's not really illegal. So to put it under illicit financial flows might not actually be fair to some companies or to that are just doing business, you know, taking advantage of laws that are there. So some of these questions bring us to the other approach of looking at illicit financial flows. So next slide, please. So in this next slide, we look at the enablers and drivers of illicit financial flows. So some of those definitional issues that I've mentioned might fall under these two types of enablers. So at the global level, we have the international legal and economic systems, as I've said, for example, that enable illicit financial flows. We, for example, have secrecy jurisdictions, which also in the keynote was alluded to, that also enables money to flow out of developing countries into developed countries, or tax havens where they go. We have a network of facilitation of illicit financial flows. We have a gender inequality element, and especially when it comes to, for example, looking at the criminal aspect of illicit financial flows, human trafficking, which basically sometimes it's more women that are being trafficked through such activities and classified under illicit financial flows. At the domestic level, the enablers of illicit financial flows include weak regulatory system, legal frameworks, also the issue of gender inequality, microeconomic policies, sometimes dependency on natural resource exports, and limited capacities. So these are some of the findings that have been there. And when I say limited capacities, it might also, as Professor Olabisi said, this is not to imply that there's no capacity in developing countries. This is to imply that sometimes some of these things, e.g. in an expertise area like transfer pricing, needs specific expertise in that particular area, and revenue authorities might not have a lot of human resources of qualified professionals in that particular area. Next slide, please. So maybe go back to that slide. So maybe just to mention here that there is UNCTAD and UNODC created a statistical task force in last year to measure and to deal with the issue of measuring and defining statistical concepts of illicit financial flows. And they will also produce another paper on the methodological guidance on measuring tax and commercial illicit financial flows, sort of to bring us up to speed and to clarify some of these areas of illicit financial flows that stem from the definitional issues. Now, on this slide, I would just like to speak a little bit about the work that I do at UNDP and our partnership, especially the Tax Inspectors Without Borders initiative, which is an initiative between UNDP and the OECD that was launched in 2015. And this is an initiative to provide tax expert support to developing countries, and it's very much demand driven. So what that means is that ministries of finance and revenue authorities write to us and request for certain types of expert assistance, especially in tax audits, which was our traditional niche area. And just, I think the one thing to highlight here is that this year in April, we just announced as Tax Inspectors Without Borders that we've raised with our partners also, that we've passed the 1 million milestone in terms of tax revenues for developing countries. These are countries not only in Africa, but also in Latin America, Asia, and other regions. But specifically, majority of our programs are in Africa. We've had 54 programs, TIWB programs in Africa, and we've also had they're currently in 39 African countries. And we've managed to help collect 592.1 million and then assessed through audits 1,807.6 million. Next slide, please. So for purposes of this, and given our success, we've decided to expand into other areas. We've expanded into criminal tax investigations, which in short, I call it tax and crime. We've expanded into effective automatic exchange of information. We've expanded into looking at extractives industry taxation and especially contracts. And we've also expanded into looking at tax and environment. For purposes of this presentation, I will just speak on our work on crime tax investigation, which IFFs falls under. Next slide, please. So our tax and crime work, which is now being rolled out, is to look at some of the complex cases at the national levels on tax and crime and the kind of capacities that exist, and also look at the systemic reforms issues that we might have, and of course partner with between host countries that provide experts and partner administrations that are mostly the national tax administrations in developing countries. And on this, our enhancement of capacity in terms of combating tax crimes and illicit financial flows is through the use of a gap analysis through a maturity model that we're developing. We're looking at legislation, risk assessment frameworks and strategies. We're also looking at operational constraints and inter-agency and international cooperations in exchange of information. We have a roster at a UNDP, which we use for our OECD TIWB collaborative work, which is a roster of experts. And then we're also reaching out to international and national organizations. One of our traditional partners in Africa, for example, is the Africa Tax Administration Forum. And you will be hearing from a key advisor from that organization and institution that partners with us on this work. Next slide, please. So back to UNDP. So as part of an expansion of the work that we're doing under TIWB, we looked at UNDP is traditionally a development organization, as you can tell from our name, which is the United Nations Development Program. So we're expanding into other areas. So with TIWB, we're raising revenue and all those figures that I was mentioning. But the question that UNDP asks is then, where does this money go after helping governments to raise a lot of revenue? So where does this money go? And through that, we started questioning issues such as, COVID and the impact of COVID and how countries can build forward better, which is an agenda at UNDP about helping countries to stabilize right now. We can't really say post-COVID, but to help countries now build forward better. We're also looking at leveraging our country offices. So I usually like to say this, that I learned after joining UNDP that we have more offices than Coca-Cola. So we have more country offices around the world than Coca-Cola does. So we want to leverage that presence of national level. We're also looking at engaging with countries through a country engagement plan, which basically means that we look at what countries are doing through domestic resource mobilization and probably some of the advocacy work we can do through the money raised in particular countries from the TIWB programs. We're looking at strengthening the role of tax policy and administration, and also linkages to revenues and expenditure, especially things like I've said, when we look at contracts, we're also looking at issues such as tax incentives. So then with this in mind, we've decided to expand into offering a tax and development project. Next slide, please. So this being my second last slide. So this tax development project, we have called this the UNDP Regional Program on Enhancing Domestic Resource Mobilization for a Renewed Contract in Africa. And this was based out of a webinar that we had in 2020 November. And so the idea here is to expand to offer more. And especially you can see from our first outcome, which is to increase capacity to tackle tax avoidance, evasion, and illicit financial flows. And we have certain activities under that, especially, for example, looking at the digital systems in tax administrations. We're also looking at the AFCFTA, the Africa Continental Free Trade Area agreements under that. And sort of how countries can make their laws, policies, and practices better to seal some of these loopholes that enable illicit financial flows. And our second outcome is linked to also the first one, but this one is basically targeted as the SDGs, because at the end of the day, we want to increase tax revenue and domestic resources for enhancement of the SDGs. Now, just to mention in finishing the social contract part, which is to involve the citizenry in Africa in the process of curbing illicit financial flows, to inform them, to make sure that these policies are being made, as Professor Olabisi said, with knowledge that is from the continent, but also knowledge that people know more about illicit financial flows and how to curb it. And with that, next slide, I think that is my conclusion on what I was asked to speak on. But here in this slide, I know all hope is not lost, and we do have, and we can, together we can achieve more if we work together and curb illicit financial flows. Thank you so much. Back to the moderator.
That was a fascinating presentation. Thank you very much. It was really interesting. Who'd have thought you could have discussed Coca-Cola and the United Nations in the same presentation? But that was great. Thank you very much. So our second speaker in the session today is Dr. Abuti from the University of Education, Munebi. And the presentation is entitled Influence of Governance Indicators on Illicit Financial Outflow from Developing Countries. Dr. Abuti, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for this opportunity. I'm trying to share my slide. Okay, my topic is the work on the influence of governance indicators on illicit financial outflow from developing countries. I must say that this work was done somewhere back in 2015, but when I saw the call for papers, I saw it very relevant to present it here. Now, listening to the first speaker, much of my problems here have been solved or have been answered with respect to the definition of illicit financial outflow, because the literature is yet to accept one definition. In fact, in all developing countries, the most important thing now to try to, we try to encourage private investment. Therefore, most of the countries here try as much as possible to come up with some policies that will attract foreign investors into the country so as to solve their problems. Unfortunately, what we realize is that as these countries or all these investors come into the country, they tend to, so to say, involve themselves in this illegal or illicit financial outflow from the country. Now, listening to the first speaker, I got the impression that how do we define illicit financial outflow? In some countries, the investors use the laws there to operate. So we will then define those things as illicit, or we define them as genuine. Now, some of these policies include tax holidays, exemption on exports, subsidized infrastructures, and limits of workers' rights. So, developing countries have been improving on this regulatory framework just as to attract foreign direct investment. But then they tend to exploit some of these policies to their advantage. Now, the definition of illicit financial outflow, I wouldn't waste much time here because a lot has been said about it. Looking at the definition by the Global Financial Integrity, as well as the financial, as well as the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development and United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. Now, so anything which comes with an illegal transfer of money is seen to be an illicit financial outflow. Now, issues on illicit financial have become very important with respect to the economic development. A lot have been said already on this, looking at how the developing countries are struggling, poverty, least developed, and so on and so forth, unemployment. And look at the quantum of money that leaves the continent every day. It's very alarming. So we have a lot of research literature that shows that illicit financial illicit financial outflows have a negative impact on economic development in in its developing countries. Therefore, they need to find solutions to them. Quoting the Secretary General of the United Nations of Conference on Trade and Development, he states categorically that illicit financial outflows and corruption are inhibiting African development, and that the people of this prospect undermining transparency and accountability and eroding trust in African institutions. This is a quote from the Secretary General of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. So governments and stakeholders need to fight this issue of illicit financial outflow. So for what this study takes to do is to try to look at the governance indicators. But when you look at all that we're talking about, it borders more on governance and see how these indicators are related to the illicit financial outflows. Now, initial review, just follow up to the first speaker. The Mbeki 2014 report did this categorization of illicit financial outflow: the commercial transactions with tax evasion and London commercial transactions. Then we have the criminal element and bribery, and then we have abuse of office by public officials. If you look at the UNCTAD, also categorize them to 4: the tax and commercial, the illicit financial outflow from corruption, theft type activities, and from illegal market. You agree with me that both categorizations are not mutually exclusive, so that some of them overlap the other. So the illicit financial flows reveal that a source of more accurate illicit flows is the mispricing of import and export. And so most of this, so as to say, the investors or multinational companies, through the illicit or invoicing, are able to take this money out. And this has been established way long in literature. That's 1974. So it's not something new. It's been done, it's been there over the years. Another one too is the tax haven. Most of these companies will have their factories in these countries, but their head office is in this tax havens, where they have just a single office. That's where they declare their profits to avoid being taxed from where this thing is being, from where they do the actual production. Now, just because they are secured of their banking secrecy, and then they also have to conceal their identities. So they try to establish their head office in these tax haven countries where there no production goes on there, but then they produce in other countries, make all the money from there, and they declare their revenue or profit in those countries to avoid being taxed. Other ones include the criminal activities ranging from money laundering, and then others. The last one is on the resource extraction contracts that are shrouded in secrecy. So the question is that how do we solve this problem? Looking at an empirical study on the illicit financial outflow, I realized that it's based on a portfolio choice model, which tried to look at how outflow from rural countries to exploration and currency losses and accretion to comparative low profit. But according to Herrick's, the PC model does not fully explain the flow that originates from economically successful industrialized countries, as well as fast-growing emerging countries, since the flows are mainly tax evasion. Now, the theory here says that we don't know which one comes first. Either the chicken and egg situation, which one comes first? Is it the egg or the chicken? Now, the consequences of illicit financial outflow is the negative impact on development. And others are also saying that because of the low development, it has also given credits to illicit financial outflow. So more or less a circular relationship between illicit financial outflow and development inhibiting economic, political, and social conditions. In other words, where in countries where they are least developed and they attract foreign investors, where they give policies that will attract them. They come and they take advantage of those policies and make away with the money. So it becomes more or less a circular thing. Now, as we've said already, most of these things borders on governance. So this study tries to look at how governance relates to the illicit financial outflow. So we have the broad definition of governance by the World Bank, saying that the sound development management is considered as central to creating and sustaining an environment that fosters strong and equitable development as an essential complement to sound economic policies, I quote. Then the issue is that how do we now relate quantitatively the governance indicators with the illicit financial outflow? Luckily, there's this empirical measure of governance, and that makes it possible for this study to be done, where we try to relate the illicit financial outflow with these governance indicators. And the governance indicator that came to mind based on literature is the governance effectiveness, regulatory quality, and control of corruption. These are the variables in governance indicators included in this study. And from the source, which is the World Bank, they define government effectiveness as the perception of the quality of public service, the quality of civil service, and the degree of its independence from political pressures, the quality of policy formulation and implementation, and the credibility of the government's commitment to such studies. They define regulatory quality as the perception of the ability of government to formulate and implement sound policies and regulations that permit and promote private sector development. And then control of corruption, the perception of the extent to which public power is exercised for private gains, including both the petty and grand forms of corruption, as well as capture of the state by elite and private interests. The data used for this study is based on secondary data from global financial integrity, world development indicators, and worldwide governance indicators. The total number of developing countries included in this analysis are 139 from 5 different geographical regions: the Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, developing Europe, Western Hemisphere, and Middle East and North Africa. The study used the multi-level approach because we realized that the illicit financial outflow will vary across these regions. Therefore, lumping them all together in a simple regression might not yield the proper or the expected results. And this is the model which was adopted. The variables in there, the control of corruption, regulatory quality, governance effectiveness. Then the foreign direct investment, the FDI, was used as a control variable in this study. We have the random intercept, and then we have the individual country FDI intercept as well. Now the results. The results successes shows that if you look at the mean financial outflow from the country, each country tells you the quantum of the flow that goes out, and then the standard deviation so high tells you that vary across countries. And for this reason, we are using this method of estimation. Now, this model specification, before we can use the multi-level estimation technique, we are supposed to ensure that there's sufficient variance represented at higher level, because the first and second level. And then the rule of thumb is that once the interclass correlation coefficient is more than 10%, then you are good to go. In this study, we found the ICC to be 13.2%, meaning that approximately 30.2% of the total variation in illicit financial outflow can be attributed to differences between the geographical regions. This is the estimated results. First of all, the random, I want to explain first of all the model diagnostic again. to ensure or to prove why we use this model. The standard deviation of the FDI, which is the independent intercept, also significant. We're also looking at the random intercept, also significant, showing that the storm variation across these regions with respect to illicit financial outflow and foreign direct investment. Now, the results. We see the foreign direct investment having a positive relationship with illicit financial outflow, trying to confirm the idea or the notion that these multinational companies are the corporate. We also have the control of corruption, which is negative. So, but here, because of the way the index is captured, those who are least corrupt are rather high on the scale. That's why we see the negative sign here. And then we have the regulatory quality also showing negative sign. Countries that are highly regulated are least, they suffer from least, they have least outflow. And then the interesting part is the government effectiveness, showing that countries which are more effective in their governance whether experience high financial outflow. So we look at the first one, the government effectiveness, having a positive and significant relationship with illicit financial outflow, and it is also consistent with previous studies that shows a link between purely illicit financial outflows and governance. It means a lot needs to be done there. Just having a good governance is not enough to curb this menace. Another one too is the regulatory quality, also indicating that countries that exhibit high regulatory quality experience less illicit financial outflow. So this result means that the ability of government to formulate and implement sound policies and regulations is paramount in the fight against illicit financial outflows. And the last one, which is control of corruption, as I said earlier on, the skill is calling those who are highly corrupt as low, and then the countries scoring low on their scale are highly corrupt, and those scoring high are less corrupt. So the negative relation between the corruption and the illicit financial outflow show that those countries which are highly corrupt experience more illicit financial outflow as compared to countries which are less corrupt. So the study found that FDI inflow, governance indicators, regulatory quality, and control of corruption influence illicit financial outflow. And then the FDI, governance, if government effectiveness and corruption have a positive and significant influence on illicit financial outflow, whilst regulatory has a negative effect. And enhance regulatory quality to control this issue. Of course, as I said earlier, the measure by the global financial integrity of the illicit financial outflow is not the best. They've even, last month or last 2 months, I saw an indication that they tried to come out with universal accepted definition and also come out how to measure the illicit financial outflow to reflect the actual thing. But in the absence of any better alternative, this data, this research use the data from the global financial integrity. And we see this is the limitation of this study. Thank you very much. End of my presentation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Abuti, for a very interesting presentation, and thank you for giving up your Saturday morning to speak to us today. Our third speaker today is the Director Chan Yil from the Financial Intelligence Centre in South Africa. The presentation is entitled The Role of Africa's Financial Intelligence Units, FIUs in Combating Financial and Economic Crimes, a South African Experience. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Nick. Good day, everyone. I'll be speaking to you about the role of the financial intelligence units. What are the financial intelligence units? Can we start on slide 3, please? The financial intelligence units are a filter between the financial sector, which are reporting and accounting institutions, mainly the banks, as well as law enforcement agencies. We work with both. We receive information from the banks, suspicious reports or cash transaction reports. We've got systems that analyzes this data, that assist us in mining the data, and we are able to produce what we call intelligence that we share with law enforcement agencies to use in the fight against illicit financial flows or any forms of financial crimes. Why are we existing? If you look at the United Nations Conventions Against Organized Crime, the Palermo Convention, you look at the United Conventions Against Corruption, and you look at the Financial Action Task Force Recommendation 29, all these papers, they recommend the establishment of the Financial Intelligence Unit. The UN Convention say each state, each member state that is authorized or mandated to fight corruption or dedicated to combat money laundering should have the ability to cooperate and exchange information at national and international level. And to that end, shall establish an FIU to serve as a national center for the collection, analysis, and dissemination of information. It's not only the Merida Convention, as I've indicated. The next slide, you'll see from the next slide, that slide 4, that it is also the Convention Against Corruption, which also encourages each member state to establish a financial intelligence unit that can be able to receive information, analyze it, and share it with law enforcement agencies with a view of fighting financial crimes. Recommendation, slide 5, recommendation 29, it also establishes financial intelligence units as a national center for the receipt and the analysis of suspicious transactions. Next slide. What's the mandate of the financial intelligence units? The financial intelligence units are there to assist in the identification of proceeds of crime. Illicit financial flows are proceeds of crime. They are also established to assist in the combating of money laundering and terrorist financing. And it's very, very important that FIUs be part of the justice cluster and work very, very close with law enforcement agencies, because the information that they get from the banks, they mine it, they interpret and assess it, and produce an intelligence that they need to give to law enforcement agencies for it to be used in successful investigations, prosecutions, and the forfeiture of assets. Slide 7, please. What's the role of financial intelligence? In the financial intelligence units, you need to have various data with you that can assist you in being able to produce a very comprehensive and detailed intelligence that law enforcement can quickly utilize. So we've got financial information that we normally receive from the banks. We're in possession of law enforcement information. We're also in possession of a lot of administrative information. The products that we send or we disseminate to law enforcement agencies is not a product that you can attach to a case docket or hand in court. It's intelligence. You use it as a guide. It guides you on where to go, and you need to do further investigation in order to be able to convert it into admissible evidence. But with the consent of the director or the head of the FIU, once you've got a written consent, you can be able really to use the products that you get from the financial intelligence unit in court, and it can be admissible. How do you use this intelligence? As I've indicated, slide 8 is very, very critical that law enforcement agencies, whether it's your police, whether it's your prosecution or your asset recovery of units, is very important that they have forensic capacity and financial investigators that are able to understand the intelligence that they receive from the FIUs and be able to convert it into admissible evidence. It's, as I've indicated, it's there to be a guide unless the FIU has said, I'm giving you authority to use this in court. I'm now going to talk to you about the Egmont group. I'm a vice chair of the Egmont group. These are the organized FIUs globally. We've got about 167 countries that are part of the Egmont group, and they've organized themselves in order to be able to share and exchange information at a global level with a view to fight financial crime, money laundering, and terrorist financing. You don't just become a member just because you are an FIU. You need to pass a certain test in order to be a member of Egmont. And the benefit of being a member of Egmont is that you've got access to a very, very secure web where you can be able to ask for information or receive information from another FIU with speed and in a very, very secure manner. And why is it very, very quick and beneficial to be a member of Egmont? You don't need to have a mutual legal assistant or extradition agreement in order to be able to share information. Once you are members, you can really just finalize an MOU in certain circumstances so that another country can understand your laws and understand how to utilize the intelligence that they receive from you. Next slide, please. What FIUs need from law enforcement agencies? We just need law enforcement agencies to understand that we deal with information sometimes that doesn't involve people who are suspects, people who have been prosecuted. So it's very, very critical that they treat it as confidential as we treat it. And it's very important that they approach us at a very early stage of investigation so that we can work with them up until the matter is ready to go to court. It's very also important that law enforcement agencies come back to FIUs to give feedback, to say, with the information that you have given me, I thought I was looking at X and Y, but I see that your information is giving me a W. Can you scratch the surface on W so that I can see what's happening? Because we look at the movement of money from the beginning. We follow a travel rule from the beginning up until its destination. So it's also very important that we get feedback so that we can see that the intelligence that we give them, is it of quality? Do we need to improve them? Did it really assist in the prosecution? Did it really assist in the prosecution getting a sentence that really sends a message? Did it assist in the forfeiture and be able to improve where we need to improve? Next slide, please. I'm going to touch on the good practice. As I've said, that it's important for FIUs to work with law enforcement agencies. In my FIU, I've got people from prosecution, from investigators, from customs sitting in my office, and it helps because we're able to deal with cases that are unknown, cases that have not been registered at the police station. We're able to see what the media has not really even picked up, not things that we're only seeing in the paper. So we're able to be proactive in fighting financial crime and bring our resources together in one space and move with speed and also see quality. So the exchange of staff, the training, regular meetings, the secondments, it's one of the best practices that we have even seen globally. Next slide, please. You have heard about the Financial Action Task Force. The professor was talking about standards. It's a body that sets global standards in fighting money laundering and terrorist financing. The executive secretary, in one of his speech at the 7th International Anti-Money Laundering and Compliance Conference, said, we are seeing an increasing numbers of good examples that are leading to the right outcomes, or with potential to do so. And this involves the public-private partnerships that goes beyond just sharing typologies to sharing actionable intelligence. I'll talk to you about the public-private partnership in South Africa. We call it a SAMLIT, South African Anti-Money Laundering Integrated Task Force, where we work with the banks, and the banks are not just forwarding us the raw suspicious transaction reports, but they are able to sit with us in some of the cases and say, what is it that Bank A is picking up? Is it Bank B also picking it up? And how can we work together to have an understanding of the financial crime that is involved and be able to generate intelligence that is of quality? In South Africa, as I've said, we've got it. It's a number of banks that are involved. And I think globally, we've got about 20 of these partnerships. So we're proud that we have it in South Africa, and I'm chairing it. We've got what we call an expert group where we look at the trends and the threats, and we have what we call a technical, sorry, go to slide 30 now. We have what we call a TOG, which is a tactical operation groups, where we deal with exact cases and we are able to learn from each other because everyone is able to bring their expertise on board, and you are able to have more than one banks looking at one individual or one syndicate. I'm now going to talk about the successes on the next slide. With the summit, since we have established it, we launched it in November, and we started doing a lot of paperwork on how we're going to function. From January 2020 to 30 June 2021, we've been able to share with law enforcement about 4,536 high quality financial intelligence. FIU has blocked 710 million, but what the law enforcement combined has been able to really forfeit to the state is to the tune of 1.7 billion. We also have what we call a public-public partnership in the name of the Fusion Center, where law enforcement agencies are sitting in the FIU, and they are able to work with us with speed on cases really that we pick up that are referred to us from the banks, or cases that we pick up as a result of the informations and the systems that we have in our building. And through working with law enforcement together, you can see from the at the bottom that we have been able to collectively recover 717.8 million to the state during this period. The Fusion Center, as I'm said, is law enforcement agencies, next slide, and we're doing proactive detection, not things that we have read about in the papers. We look at the media analysis, what the papers are telling us, open source information. We deal with cases where no one has gone to the police station to open a docket, but because we have read in the media or open source or things that are reported through whistleblowing, we are able really to deal with these matters and end up really having a case docket registered. I'm now going to go to a slide on illicit financial flows. I'm not going to deal with the definition, but we've got a working group on illicit financial flows in the country, wherein we've got the Reserve Bank under the name of financial surveillance. We've got SARS, your South African Revenue Service. We've got your asset recovery. We've got FIU. We've got your Hawks. Those are the police that are mandated to deal with serious corruption. And we are working together in one office looking at these cases. And we can't deal with all the cases because it's a lot of crime really happening in our country. We're dealing only with cases where the threshold, the amount involved exceeds 100 million, and cases where one or two of the agencies really is interested in that case. And with those cases, because we are working as a collective and each one really has a focus, we are able to really to move. We always try to really keep the number to 10. Once we've finalized 2, we add another 2. Next slide, slide 18, you'll see that what we have recovered about 475 million in about 8 cases. In the next slide, you'll see the key role players in the illicit financial flow working group. It's your FIC. Next slide, please. You'll see the role of the FIC there. You've got your Reserve Bank, you've got your South African Revenue Service, and you've got the Hawks, and you've got the Asset Forfeiture Unit. With the Asset Forfeiture Unit, we also have a mechanism of ensuring, because asset forfeiture, don't wait for a person to be convicted before they move. We're able to sit with them in our office, in the Financial Intelligence Unit office, and whatever we see, whatever we analyze, we share it with them. And we have grown further now in a sense that we don't only share intelligence, but we are able to even provide them an affidavit that they can attach to their founding papers as a supporting affidavit and approach a court ex parte and obtain an order. And next slide, you'll see how successful we have been. We have been able to recover about 244.1 million working together with FIUs, and we've been able, the next slide, slide 22, you'll see we have shared with them during this period. Next slide, we have shared 24 affidavits, and we have recovered 1.4 billion. The challenges is that most of the countries, especially in Africa, we don't invest in having financial investigators or forensic investigators that are trained to follow the money or understand intelligence. That's what we need to improve. We need to improve the prosecution of money laundering, not just your standalone, but your third party, your trade-based money laundering, your complex money laundering, and send good sentences. And we need to improve on the utilization of financial intelligence report. And not all the countries have FIUs. It's very important that all the countries have FIUs. So I've touched on the challenges, but what I want to mention is that when it comes to the recovery of proceeds of crime globally, we've failed. FATF, with the study that they've done, they've seen that globally we're recovering about 1% of the proceeds of crime. The EU study is showing that we're recovering only 1.1% proceeds, which is still a fail. So we still need to ensure that each country has a asset forfeiture unit or asset recovery unit, and it works very, very close with the FIUs so that we can improve the recovery of illicit financial flows. The recommendations also is to ensure that we share information and we establish public-private partnerships and public-public partnerships. You cannot fight illicit financial flows. You cannot fight corruption working in isolation. So silos needs to be killed, and we need to work together. Thank you very much for having me. And you can really, the slides, Nick, can be shared with everyone. I'm hoping next time we'll have more time to discuss these issues. Thank you.
That was very interesting. Thank you. I thought the discussion of the exchange of information is very prevalent, and I know it's been very successful within the UK. So maybe that's something that people can discuss up a little bit later on in the conference. And our final speaker in the first session today is Ms. Varsha Singh from the African Tax Administration Forum. And the presentation is entitled African Solutions to Illicit Financial Flows. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Good afternoon and good morning to everyone, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me to speak today and to share with you a little on what we at ATAF are doing. If we look at, previous speakers have spoken about the extent of illicit financial flows, the fact that we don't currently have an agreed or definition on IFFs. But when we look at domestic resource mobilization, the one thing that we know is that taxation is important to the mobilization of revenue, which is essential to meeting the Sustainable Development Goals. And also African leaders have committed to establishing an enabling framework for domestic resource mobilization, as articulated in the African Union's Agenda 2063. We also know that the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development presented a report in 2020 outlining illicit financial flows in Africa. This report delved into the multilateral discourse on IFFs in Africa, considered the impacts on the Sustainable Development Goals, and estimated the magnitude of IFFs and made recommendations to tackle this. We also have the Factory Report, which cautions that IFFs from trade misinvoicing, tax abuse, cross-border corruption, and transnational financial crime drains resources from sustainable development, as well as worsens the inequalities, fuels instability, undermines governance, and damages public trust. Currently, as we've heard, Africa is estimated to losing more than 50 billion annually in IFFs. But these estimates may well fall short of reality because, again, as we've heard, accurate data does not exist in many African countries. And these estimates often exclude many forms of IFFs that cannot be properly estimated, such as the proceeds of bribery, trafficking of drugs, people, and firearms. So many organizations over the years have come up with policies and strategies to curb IFFs. The African Union, through the high-level panel, FACTI, and ATAF, is among the organizations trying to stem the flow of IFFs. However, it must be noted that since IFFs are a global problem, concerted efforts and international cooperation is key to curbing this. The high-level panel report estimates, as we've heard from previous speakers, that there is an estimate of 65% that is being conducted via commercial transactions through tax evasion, tax avoidance. And this is where ATAF, given its mandate, has focused in the fight against IFFs amongst its members over the years. IFFs diminishes the country's tax base and undermines domestic resource mobilization. This results in less revenue for governments and a decrease in fiscal space and public investment, leading to reduced provisions of high-quality public goods and social investment. If we look at what ATAF's role in IFFs has been, we've been concentrating on transfer pricing, BIPs by multinationals, trade misinvoicing, unequal contracts, unlimited transparency, and tax incentives. When we look at transfer pricing, and again, the high-level panel states that it is the large companies that engage in IFFs through abusive transfer pricing, trade misinvoicing of services and intangibles, and the use of unequal contracts. They exploit the lack of information and capacity, the limitation of government agencies to engage in base erosion and profit-shifting activities. Over the years, ATAF has been assisting its members in developing transfer pricing in the tax administrations. This has been through developing legislation where legislation does not exist, looking at legislation that is there and tightening clauses. ATAF has built effective auditing skills amongst its members and has established transfer pricing units. Currently, we have 40 members that are African countries that are members of ATAF, and 35% of our members have transfer pricing units in place. There is still a lot to be done. We need to increase that substantially, and the efforts are in place to make sure that that is being done. However, since 2019, you will find that we've had approximately 244 audit cases that were opened. We had tax assessed, which is at about $1.2 billion US. On the other area of exchange of information, we are still lagging behind on the continent due to a number of factors, including the lack of extensive treaty networks. Meaning that countries don't benefit from receiving country-by-country reports. Exchanges amongst the African countries remain low compared to other developing countries. While there is an improvement, there is still much more to be done to ensure that more requests are sent and received. This also includes automatic exchange of information. We still need to do more on that. ATAF, in terms of the solutions, have been assisting members by making toolkits available on exchange of information, has built capacity on officials as well as auditors, and has also, there is currently 22 countries that have competent authorities. About 37% of our members that have exchange of information units in place. Exchange of information requests have increased by 48% between 2018 and 2019. And on automatic exchange of information, even though there is a lot more to be done on the continent, we had in 2020, Nigeria received their first exchange. joining countries like Seychelles, South Africa, Mauritius, and Ghana. And Kenya and Morocco are committed to their first exchange in 2022. So if we look at trade misinvoicing, it has been estimated that Africa has lost over $1 trillion on IFFs during the last 50 years. This equals to about 54% in trade misinvoicing. More recent estimates for Africa suggest that IFFs based on trade misinvoicing alone amounts to $1.3 trillion US dollars. That was between 1980 and 2018. Trade misinvoicing flows are a subclass of illicit financial flows between countries, which broadly can be defined as illegal movements of value from one country to another. ATAF has built capacities in many of the tax administrations by training auditors and other tax officials in identifying, detecting, deterring trade misinvoicing. But as we heard from the previous speaker, that we need to come together to address these areas. We need to have more interagency cooperation. We need to have tax and customs work together. In Africa, many of our revenue administrations are tax and customs, but we find that in West Africa, they are separate, so we need to bring more of them together with other government agencies. If we look at double tax treaties, they are an important part and aspect of international tax law. However, many African countries have signed few tax treaties, and some of these treaties were entered into mainly as a political gesture. However, we find over the last decade, the attitude of many African countries to tax treaties has changed, as demonstrated by their expanding tax treaty network. In this regard, ATAF has developed a model tax treaty agreement, which addresses specific challenges for African countries. So African countries, you have the OECD model, you have the UN model, but there is an African model, which is the ATAF model. So countries can take that and use that in their negotiations. ATAF has also provided training in building tax treaty negotiation skills so that countries amongst our members can increase their treaty networks. Tax incentives is another important area that we need to look at. And many African countries grant tax incentives to grant foreign investors incentives to encourage foreign investments in their countries. Tax incentives has been noted to distort resource allocation, leading to suboptimal investment decisions that are harmful in the long term. ATAF has been working with the tax administrations to carry out a cost-benefit analysis on the granting of tax incentives. But another issue on tax incentives is linked to the external environment, which poses increasing challenges. And this is the continued heavy reliance of many countries on trade revenues. For instance, this means that continued trade liberalization poses significant challenges in recovering revenue from other sources and striking the right balance between an attractive tax regime for domestic and foreign investment. And what they do is they use tax incentives and to secure the necessary revenues for public spending. This is a policy dilemma and needs to be addressed further. ATAF is determined to continue doing its part in the fight against IFFs and will endeavor to continue engaging our partners in reducing and minimizing the flow of IFFs from the African continent. It should be noted that, however, that those involved in the struggle should not give up given the following challenges. These include the lack of genuine cooperation amongst agencies across government and the need for a more robust interagency cooperation, both at a financial and enforcement level. And I think that the South African example that has been cited by the previous speaker is one that we should definitely be looking at more. The lack of cooperation from global partners is another challenge. There is a need for a concerted effort and cooperation in returning the stolen assets and wealth. So far, this has not been very successful, and financial institutions outside Africa where these assets are kept tend to make it hard for money to return from where it may have allegedly been stolen. Corruption, as we've also heard previously, continues to grow and thrive in many countries. We need much more political will, and this we need to do at a government level. The others is the coordination of policies. Weak policies regarding IFFs is another handicap. And I think that we need to come together and work much more at a whole of government level to be able to address the issue of IFFs. ATAF will be working with other partners like the African Union Commission, the UNDP, as mentioned by Lucky Star, and to address illicit financial flows, and will be focusing more on other areas, which would include also interagency cooperation. Lastly, if we look at the importance to combat IFFs, this is important because it is a fundamental determinant of growth, development, and governance, security, and the rule of law, and as such should be considered a significant disabler of sustainable development. We need to, the time is right. There's been a lot of talk about IFFs. We need to come together to put practical solutions on the table and to make sure that we as Africa are able to curb IFFs. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm obviously very conscious of time, that we've run over a little bit in relation to the 11 finish. So if anyone's got any questions, could you please put them into the chat box and put them up as the questions? I might be able to possibly take one or two maximum questions. So I'm just having a quick look through, so please bear with me a moment. We've got one question from Marissa from Shmuel, who'd like to ask, what is your opinion according to the situation that was caused as a result of COVID-19 pandemic, and will that support a more effective struggle against financial corruption? So Marissa, I don't know if you wanted to maybe answer that question for us.
You want, I will ask by microphone?
Yes, if you can, or if not, if you want to reply in the chat, that's absolutely fine. It's entirely up to you.
Okay, I wanted to ask how COVID-19 crisis will help in improving of struggle against financial corruption. And the second part of my question, how situation of COVID-19 can to help in acceleration of SDG ideas in Africa and other poor regions around the world.
It's great. Thank you for your question. Can I open up to the panelists if anyone's got any view on the potential impacts of COVID-19? Has anyone got any comments or thoughts?
Sorry, Nick, I couldn't hear the question, but if the question is on COVID-19, what we've picked up during this period it's a lot of misdirection of funds that have happened during COVID-19. And what we have done in the Fusion Center, where I was talking about the public-public partnership, we've been able to say this is our priority, and we have also negotiated with the summit that they also prioritize these cases, and we've been able to work together and really even being able to even advise the AG or the Office of the Attorney of the Auditor General on things that we've picked up. People who have been double paid, people who were owning service stations, all of a sudden they got big tenders and they can't even deliver. So it's a lot of corruption that we've been able to pick up, but we had dedicated component that just dealt with those cases, and we're prioritizing all those cases even now. And we have what we call a SIU, which is a special investigative unit. They've done a lot of work in even stopping contracts where people are about to be paid. We've stopped contracts, where people have been paid, they've been taken to the tribunal so that they can pay back what they've already received. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much for your answer. And I think that's pretty much what we've seen similar with the UK as well. We've seen obviously a significant increase of fraud related into COVID in excess of 50 billion pounds. So it will be intriguing to see what the enforcement responses of the HM Revenue and Customs. I'm very conscious of time. It's now 11:35 and we've run a little bit over, I'm afraid. So I don't think we've got any more time for questions, but I do see that there are more questions in the chat. So if any of the speakers are very happy to reply to direct questions or general questions. But on behalf of myself and the conference organizer, I'd like to thank all of our speakers for fantastic, very intriguing presentations. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. I'd like to pass over now to our next conference organizer. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Nick.